Picture this. A young engineer hunched over blueprints in a dimly lit office in Long Island, suddenly realizes he's made a catastrophic error. The numbers don't add up. The aircraft he's designing is too heavy, too big, too impossible. His hands tremble as he recalculates, hoping he's wrong. But he's not. Alexander Kartveli has just created a monster that, by all accounts, should never fly. His superiors will be furious. The military contract could be cancelled. His career might be over. But what Kartveli doesn't know yet, what nobody in that room in 1940 could possibly comprehend, is that this mistake, this beautiful disaster of engineering, will become the most feared machine in the European skies. It will tear through the Luftwaffe like a thunderstorm through paper walls. It will save thousands of American lives. And it will rewrite the rules of aerial warfare forever. This is the story of how one man's miscalculation became Hitler's nightmare. The year is 1939, and the world is watching Europe burn. Poland has fallen in weeks. France will be next. And in America, military planners are sweating through their uniforms, knowing that sooner or later, American boys will be flying into that inferno. The problem is they don't have the right plane. The fighters they're building are good, sure, but good isn't enough when you're facing the Messerschmitt Bf 109, flown by pilots who've already tasted blood over Warsaw and are hungry for more. Enter Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian immigrant who escaped the Russian Revolution with nothing but his mind and his hands. He'd found his way to America, to Republic Aviation, where he'd already made a name for himself designing the P-43 Lancer. But the Lancer wasn't cutting it. Army Air Corps officers were clear. They needed something better, something that could escort bombers deep into Germany, something that could fight and win at altitudes where the air is so thin you can barely breathe. The specifications were brutal. The military wanted a fighter that could fly at 35,000 feet, cruise at 350 miles per hour, carry 8 machine guns, and still have enough fuel to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. It was, by any reasonable standard, impossible. Engineers at other companies were throwing up their hands. The weight requirements alone were absurd. To carry that much fuel and armament at that altitude, you'd need an engine so powerful it didn't exist yet. But Kartveli didn't give up easily. He started sketching, calculating, dreaming. He began with the engine because everything starts with the engine. The Allison V1710 was the obvious choice, liquid-cooled, reliable, already powering the P-40 Warhawk. He wrapped his design around it, creating a sleek, relatively lightweight fighter that looked fast just sitting on paper. He was proud of it. He showed it to his team. They nodded approvingly. This could work. Then Pratt & Whitney changed everything. They announced a new engine, the R2800 Double Wasp. It was a radial engine, air-cooled, with 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows like the petals of a mechanical flower. And it was powerful. Incredibly powerful. 2,000 horsepower, more than any fighter engine in production. When Kartveli heard the specs, his heart must have skipped. This was the answer. This was how you get to 35,000 feet. This was how you win. But here's where the mistake happened. Here's where everything went wrong or right depending on how you look at it. The R2800 wasn't just powerful. It was massive. It was a radial engine, which meant it was wide, circular, creating enormous drag. And it was heavy. Very heavy. When Kartveli started plugging the numbers into his sleek design, everything fell apart. The weight of the engine required a stronger airframe. The drag required more wing area. More wing area meant more weight, which meant more fuel to carry the weight, which meant more weight still. It was a cascade, an engineering avalanche that kept growing with every calculation. Kartveli worked through the night, trying to make it fit, trying to keep his elegant design intact. But the math was merciless. By the time he was done, his lightweight fighter had ballooned into something else entirely. The P-47 Thunderbolt, as it would be called, weighed over 13,000 pounds fully loaded. That's nearly double what a Spitfire weighed. It was huge, bigger than any single-engine fighter anyone had ever seen. Pilots would later joke that if you had to bail out, you could walk around the plane first to stretch your legs. When Kartveli presented the final design to Republic Aviation's leadership, you can imagine the silence in that room. This wasn't what they'd promised the military. This wasn't the sleek interceptor they'd envisioned. This was a flying tank, a brute, a machine that looked more like a bomber than a fighter. Some executives must have wondered if they should start over, if they should admit defeat and redesign from scratch with a different engine. But there was no time. War was coming fast. Europe was falling. And something about this beast, this accidental monster, felt right. Kartveli had made a mistake, yes, but he'd also solved every problem the military had thrown at him. The P-47 could fly at 40,000 feet, higher than almost anything else in the sky. It had 850 caliber machine guns, more firepower than any fighter in the world. It had armor plating protecting the pilot, a luxury most fighters couldn't afford. And that massive radial engine? It could take punishment. You could shoot holes through the cylinders and it would keep running, keep flying, keep fighting. The military approved the design in September 1940, and Republic Aviation started building prototypes. The first XP-47B took to the skies on May 6, 1941. Test pilot Lowry Brabham climbed into the cockpit, fired up that massive Pratt & Whitney engine, and felt the whole airframe shudder with power. When he pushed the throttle forward, the Thunderbolt didn't just take off. It exploded into the air, climbing at a rate that left observers on the ground slack-jawed. This thing was fast. Shockingly fast. It could hit 430 miles per hour in level flight, making it one of the fastest production fighters in the world. But speed wasn't even its greatest asset. What really set the P-47 apart was its high-altitude performance. Up where the air is thin and your lungs scream for oxygen, where most fighters started to gasp and lose power, the Thunderbolt thrived. That massive engine was supercharged, force-feeding air into the cylinders even at altitudes where there was barely any air to breathe. At 35,000 feet, while Messerschmitts were struggling, the P-47 was just getting started. The first Thunderbolts arrived in England in late 1942, and the reaction from pilots was mixed, to put it politely. These were men used to flying the P-40 Warhawk and the P-39 Airacobra, nimble fighters that responded to the slightest touch. The P-47 felt like flying a truck. It was heavy on the controls, slow to turn, and required a runway the length of a football field to take off. Pilots nicknamed it the Jug, short for juggernaut, and not in a loving way. Some of them looked at this massive machine and wondered if Kartveli and Republic Aviation had lost their minds. Then they took it into combat. Then everything changed. The first P-47 mission over occupied Europe happened on March 10, 1943. 56 Thunderbolts, their engines roaring like controlled explosions, climbed into the cold morning sky over England and headed east. The pilots were nervous, uncertain. They'd heard the stories about the Luftwaffe, about experienced German pilots who'd been fighting since the invasion of Poland, who could spot a weakness and exploit it in seconds. The Thunderbolts crossed the English Channel, flying high, so high that contrails streamed behind them like white ribbons across the sky. Below, the coast of France appeared, occupied territory, enemy ground. Every pilot knew that if they went down there, they were either dead or spending the rest of the war in a prisoner camp. The radio crackled with nervous chatter. Eyes scanned the sky for black dots that could be German fighters. Then contact. Focke-Wulf 190s, fast and aggressive, diving out of the sun. The German pilots had seen the Thunderbolts coming and positioned themselves perfectly for a bounce. They came screaming down, guns blazing, expecting to shred these new American fighters like they'd shredded so many before. What they didn't expect was what happened next. The P-47 pilots did something counterintuitive. Instead of trying to turn and dogfight, which would have been suicide in such a heavy aircraft, they dove. They pushed their sticks forward and let gravity and that massive engine do the work. The Thunderbolts accelerated like falling meteors, faster and faster, pulling away from the German fighters who couldn't keep up in a dive. Then, using all that speed and altitude, the American pilots zoomed back up, climbing at impossible angles, regaining their height advantage, and suddenly they were the hunters instead of the hunted. It was a revelation. The P-47 couldn't turn with a German fighter in a traditional dogfight. But it didn't need to. It could dive faster than anything in the sky. It could climb back up using energy tactics that German pilots had never encountered. And when those 850 caliber machine guns opened fire, the result was devastating. The Germans called it the rat-a-tat-tat because of the distinctive sound those guns made, a sound that became synonymous with death. That first mission was a success, but it was just the beginning. Over the following months, P-47 pilots developed tactics specifically designed to maximize the Thunderbolt's strengths. They called it boom and zoom. Fly high, spot the enemy below, dive at maximum speed, fire a burst, then use that speed to climb back up before the enemy could react. It was efficient, deadly, and almost impossible to counter. But the Thunderbolt's greatest moment, the mission that would cement its legacy forever, came during the big week in February 1944. The Allied High Command had decided it was time to break the Luftwaffe's back once and for all. They planned a massive bombing campaign against German aircraft factories, and they knew the Germans would throw everything they had into the sky to stop them. It would be the largest air battle in history, and the P-47 Thunderbolts would be at the center of it. On the morning of February 20, 1944, over 1,000 American bombers took off from bases across England. Their target was Luftwaffe production facilities deep inside Germany. Escorting them were hundreds of fighters, including massive formations of P-47 Thunderbolts. The pilots knew this was it, the day they'd been training for, the day that would determine whether Allied bombers could survive over Germany. The Luftwaffe responded with everything they had. Over 500 German fighters scrambled into the air, Messerschmitt 109s, Focke-Wulf 190s, even some of the new jet-powered Me-262s. The sky over Germany became a swirling chaos of aircraft, contrails, tracer rounds, and explosions. Bombers fell in flames. Fighters spun out of control, their wings shredded by gunfire. It was hell at 25,000 feet. And the Thunderbolts were magnificent. They dove through formations of German fighters, their 8-guns spitting fire. They protected the bombers, positioning themselves between the vulnerable B-17s and the attacking Germans. When a Focke-Wulf tried to make a run at a bomber, a P-47 would appear out of nowhere, diving at ridiculous speed, firing a burst that would either destroy the German fighter or force it to break off its attack. The battle lasted hours. Pilots flew until their fuel tanks were nearly empty, until their ammunition was gone, until their arms ached from fighting the heavy controls. And when they finally turned for home, leaving the burning factories and the wreckage of dozens of aircraft behind them, they'd won. The Luftwaffe lost over 200 aircraft that week. Production facilities were destroyed. Experienced pilots were killed. The Germans never fully recovered. Over the course of the war, P-47 Thunderbolts would shoot down over 3,700 German aircraft, more than any other Allied fighter in the European theater. 3,700. That number is staggering. Each one of those kills represents a moment of skill, courage, and terror. A German pilot, probably young, probably scared, meeting his end in the sky over his own country, shot down by a machine that shouldn't have existed, a machine born from a mistake. But the Thunderbolt's contribution went far beyond air-to-air combat. Its rugged construction, that heavy airframe that pilots had initially complained about, made it perfect for ground attack missions. P-47s carried bombs, rockets, and napalm. They strafed German convoys, destroyed tanks, blew up trains, and turned the tide of battles on the ground. During the Battle of the Bulge, when German forces made their last desperate push through the Ardennes in winter 1944, it was P-47 Thunderbolts that broke through the clouds and shattered the German advance, destroying hundreds of vehicles and tanks. Pilots loved the Thunderbolt because it brought them home. That massive radial engine could take incredible damage and keep running. There are stories of P-47s returning to base with entire cylinders shot off, with holes you could stick your fist through, with hydraulic lines severed and electrical systems destroyed, and they still flew. The armor plating protected pilots from ground fire. The rugged airframe could withstand damage that would have torn apart lighter fighters. If you had to get shot at, you wanted to be in a Thunderbolt. Alexander Kartveli never intended to design the perfect fighter. He was trying to meet a set of specifications, trying to solve an engineering problem. When that massive R-2800 engine forced him to redesign everything, to make the plane bigger and heavier, it must have felt like failure. But sometimes mistakes, real mistakes, open doors that careful planning never could. The P-47's weight made it stable at high speed. Its size gave it room for fuel and ammunition. Its rugged construction saved countless lives. All the things that seemed like problems turned out to be advantages. After the war, Kartveli was celebrated as one of the great aircraft designers of his generation. He went on to design other successful aircraft, including the F-84 Thunderjet and the F-105 Thunderchief. But nothing he created would ever have the impact of the P-47. That accidental monster, that beautiful mistake, changed the course of World War II. Today, only a handful of P-47 Thunderbolts remain airworthy. They appear at air shows, their massive radial engines roaring to life, reminding crowds of a time when the sky over Europe was a battlefield and young men climbed into these machines knowing they might not come home. When you see one fly, when you hear that distinctive sound of 18 cylinders firing in sequence, you're hearing history. You're hearing the sound that German pilots learned to fear, the sound of thunder rolling across the sky. The P-47 Thunderbolt shot down 3,700 German aircraft not because it was perfect, but because it was perfectly imperfect. It was too heavy to dogfight, so it learned to boom and zoom. It was too big to be elegant, so it became rugged and survivable. It was born from a mistake, from miscalculations and compromises, and it became one of the most successful combat aircraft in history. Alexander Kartveli's mistake teaches us something profound about innovation and war and human ingenuity. Sometimes the best solutions come from constraints, from problems that force us to think differently. The P-47 wasn't what anyone wanted. It was what happened when reality crashed into idealism and created something unexpected. And in the crucible of war, when lives hung in the balance and the fate of nations was being decided in the sky, that unexpected creation proved to be exactly what was needed. But there's more to this story, details that make the Thunderbolt's legacy even more remarkable. Because while Kartveli's mistake created the machine, it was the pilots who turned it into a legend. And their stories, their individual moments of courage and terror, reveal the true human cost and triumph of this accidental masterpiece. Take Robert Johnson for example. In June 1943, this farm boy from Oklahoma was flying his P-47 over France when he encountered a formation of Focke-Wulf 190s. Johnson was alone, separated from his squadron, and suddenly he had 16 German fighters on his tail. 16. The odds were impossible. Any rational person would have tried to run, to dive for the deck and hope to escape. But Johnson turned into them. He used every tactic the Thunderbolt allowed, diving, climbing, using his speed to stay ahead of their guns. The battle lasted 20 minutes, an eternity when you're fighting for your life at 300 miles per hour. His P-47 took hit after hit. Cannon shells tore through the fuselage. His canopy was shattered. Blood ran down his face from glass cuts. But the Thunderbolt kept flying and Johnson kept fighting. He shot down one German fighter, then another. The rest finally broke off, low on fuel and ammunition, unable to believe this lone American was still in the air. Johnson limped back to England with over 200 holes in his aircraft. The ground crew counted every single one. The plane was a wreck, but it had brought him home. That's what Kartveli's mistake could do. It could take punishment that would have killed any other pilot and still get you home to fight another day. Or consider the story of Francis Gabreski, a Polish-American pilot who would become the top American ace in Europe. Gabreski understood the P-47 in a way that bordered on spiritual. He knew exactly how far he could push it, exactly how much speed he could trade for altitude, exactly when to fire and when to hold his shot. He flew the Thunderbolt like it was an extension of his body. By the end of his tour, he had 28 confirmed kills, 28 German pilots who made the mistake of thinking that big heavy American fighter would be easy prey. Gabreski once said that the P-47 wasn't just a machine, it was a promise. A promise that if you flew it right, if you respected what it could and couldn't do, it would bring you through hell and back. The Thunderbolt earned another nickname as the war progressed. Pilots started calling it the Unbreakable. Stories circulated of P-47s coming home with damage that defied belief. One pilot landed with 3 feet of his right wing missing, sheared off by German flak. Another made it back with his entire tail section held on by a few strips of metal, the control cables barely functional. There was the famous incident of a P-47 that collided mid-air with a Messerschmitt 109. The German fighter disintegrated. The Thunderbolt had a massive dent in its wing and kept flying. The pilot didn't even realize what had happened until he landed and saw the damage. This reputation for survival changed the psychology of air combat over Europe. German pilots began to avoid engaging P-47s when possible, preferring to target the lighter, more vulnerable P-51 Mustangs and P-38 Lightnings. The Thunderbolt had become feared not just for its firepower, but for its refusal to die. You could hit it, you could hurt it, but bringing one down required sustained fire and perfect accuracy. And in a dogfight, when everything is happening in seconds, when you're pulling 6GS and your vision is tunneling, perfect accuracy is nearly impossible. The ground attack role, which became increasingly important as the war moved from the air to the earth below, revealed yet another dimension of Kartveli's accidental genius. The P-47's weight, that supposedly fatal flaw, made it remarkably stable as a dive bomber. Lighter fighters would bounce and wobble when carrying heavy ordnance. The Thunderbolt just shrugged and kept flying straight. Pilots could aim with precision, releasing bombs and rockets onto German tanks, trains and fortifications with devastating accuracy. During the Normandy invasion in June 1944, when Allied forces stormed the beaches and faced fierce German resistance, it was P-47 Thunderbolts that provided critical air support. They flew low over the battlefield, so low that pilots could see the faces of soldiers on the ground. They struck German positions just ahead of advancing Allied troops, clearing the way, destroying machine gun nests and artillery positions that could have massacred hundreds. General George Patton himself said that the P-47 was worth its weight in gold, that he'd rather have air support from Thunderbolts than an entire armored division. And here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. The P-47 didn't just save American and British lives. It saved German lives too, in a strange, roundabout way. By ending the war faster. Every German aircraft the Thunderbolt shot down was one less plane dropping bombs on Allied cities, one less threat that prolonged the conflict. Every German tank destroyed from the air was one less obstacle to Allied advance. The faster the Allies could push into Germany, the faster the war would end, the fewer people would die on both sides. The Thunderbolt was a weapon of war, yes, but it was also, paradoxically, a tool of peace, helping to bring a terrible conflict to its conclusion. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, over 15,000 P-47 Thunderbolts had been built. 15,000 of Kartveli's mistakes, flying over Europe, the Pacific, the Mediterranean. They served in every theater, adapted to every role, proving again and again that sometimes the best designs aren't the ones that look perfect on paper, but the ones that survive contact with reality and come out stronger. After the war ended, many Thunderbolts were simply scrapped. Melted down, turned into refrigerators and car parts, their metal recycled for a world trying to rebuild. It seems almost criminal now, destroying these machines that had done so much, that carried so much history in their battered airframes. But that was the reality of post-war economics. They were tools that had served their purpose, and peacetime had no use for fighters designed to kill. The few that survived became treasures. Museums fought to acquire them. Aviation enthusiasts spent fortunes restoring them to flying condition. Today, when a P-47 takes to the sky at an air show, when that massive radial engine coughs to life and settles into its distinctive rumble, people stop and stare. They hear echoes of a different time, when the sky was a battlefield and young men flew these machines into the teeth of death because freedom itself hung in the balance. 3,700 German aircraft. Thousands of ground targets destroyed. Countless lives saved. All because one engineer made a mistake and decided to keep going anyway, to see where the problem led, to trust that sometimes the detour is the destination. The Thunderbolt didn't win the war alone, but it played its part, flying high above the carnage, dealing thunder from the sky, proving that mistakes, when handled with courage and creativity, can change the world. And reminding us that sometimes the most powerful innovations come not from perfect planning, but from the beautiful chaos of things going wrong in exactly the right way.